Heads up. Keith.
Hello, folks. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to have a few comments from the perspective of a regulator who's sort of practically engaged in this day-to-day. I'll begin by noting the presence of some of my colleagues and former colleagues, and thank you for coming as well. But my main message today is for us, whether to engage communities and the public and Indigenous groups in risk decisions is no longer a choice. It's a fact. The question really is how best to do it, how to ensure that they feel they have a meaningful chance to input into the risk deliberation process, and how for the risk deliberators to make sure that what they get is meaningful and useful information, which goes to some of the tensions that Scott's mentioned. And I'll say that our experience to date, it's evolving. It's by no means the logical endpoint of a public involvement a process. And I'd say obviously that our stakeholders probably wouldn't say that they're perfectly satisfied with where we are either. But I think I would feel comfortable saying that certainly for the CNSC, we believe that beyond the societal value of engaging the public in risk deliberation, the truth is it actually brings quite a bit of value. So it results in more meaningful and better deliberation. So far from being a negative or a threat or a risk to be managed, it's actually a positive aspect of involvement. And, we've been on a little bit of a journey for 10 years in this regard, and our experience has changed the way we look at a lot of public involvement. But to get there, the public has to be facilitated to some degree in how they engage. So it's not a question of just providing them with a space to input into a public or formal process, or just a matter of procedural fairness. I think there's an active component of facilitation that has to go on to get people to where they can input to where into a way that they feel comfortable with. I could talk at length about some of these mechanisms, but we've certainly seen a growth in our need to fund participants to participate. We've had people engaged in our environmental monitoring and sampling campaigns, and that certainly brought a lot of value. So there are a number of mechanisms that you can employ to help people understand more about the nature of the risks that are confronting them, and that will result in better input into deliberations. Flexibility is important. Our initial model was based on a formal hearing process where we enabled people to speak in a hearing, but over time we've recognized there's great value from broadening our engagement and outreach activities to include ways and mechanisms to get the public more engaged. And a typical example of this would be the funding of Indigenous knowledge studies, which is something we've taken on recently. We need to recognize the importance of long-term sustained engagement to shaping the input into risk deliberations. We are a life cycle regulator, so when we get an application, the first of its kind application, that's only the start of the risk assessment process. The risk assessment process continues throughout the life cycle of the facility. And if we take advantage and leverage all the engagement activities, we'll see a continuous improvement in the risk assessments over time. And really that's been quite valuable. And the last point I make before turning to some of the questions is that it's difficult to understate the importance of Indigenous input into our deliberations. As we are, as CNSC recognizes the Crown in terms of duty to consult, but we're actually moving well past that into getting to the nation-to-nation deliberations that I think are now expected of us. And that's a very complex, very difficult undertaking, but our staff are finding it very rewarding. And if I could add one thing, when I talked to quite a few of our scientific staff about their opinions in public deliberation, they felt it made them better scientists, better better human beings in a lot of ways. So they saw a lot of the value in public deliberation. Far from being a threat, it's really changed how they approach their task. I'll just point out that in our sense, the real risk deliberators are our commission itself. It's a panel of up to 7 appointed permanent members who are appointed by the governing council. It's a quasi-judicial body, so that the legal framework around deliberation is extremely important. Their decisions aren't subject to a parliamentary review, but they are subject to judicial review. And their mandate is actually pretty broad. In terms of our act, all it really says is their task is to determine the extent to which the risks risk to the health and safety of people in the environment are reasonable, which is actually a pretty broad statement of risk tolerance. So they're at some liberty to take multiple information sources and turn it into a judgment of what is reasonable or not. So I'll go straight to some of the operational implications. I think of engaging the public more meaningfully. The obvious ones that Scott touched on are time and money. Our experience has been that the amount of money it takes to help people come to the commission and present good information is not necessarily hugely expensive. It's often measured in the few thousands of dollars rather than tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. But time is certainly the more important criteria, not just in terms of the length of time it takes for the process, but our staff are in short supply. Specialists don't grow on trees, and they're often need to prioritize between traditional formal risk assessment and which oversees the licensees and responding to the interventions of the public. So that's a difficult tension to resolve. Just as importantly, though, is access to data by the public and other groups, and that's becoming more and more critical. They need to be facilitated in their access to data. It's not enough just to dump a large volume of data on them and say, there you go, input into the process. We need to, in some ways, explain the data, help them interpret it, make sure that they can access fully, and that certainly is something that needs to happen. From a purely practical end, staff skills have to be considered. It's not always the case that your staff have the inherent ability to listen actively, to respond to public concerns. So they need to be supported in their ability to do so, and they do so willingly if you give them the chance. So it's just something that need to be considered. You need to respond at a level that's meaningful to the community. So the subject matter experts have to not only be able to address the results of the assessments or the public needs in terms not only that are meaningful to themselves, but to the community that's requesting them. A couple of other things, I guess, it may seem an obvious one for an operational implication, but you need to go to the communities that are where they are. We live in a big country. There's a lot of distance, sometimes physical distance between various communities. They can't all be run from Ottawa. So to get meaningful public input and engagement, you often have to be willing to physically to go to where the communities are. It may seem obvious, but it's important. The other point I'd make is the importance of personal relationships. It's very easy to sort of view things as a faceless government employee, but what we've found is that building personal networks, communications, making sure people, the same people, are engaged with the public on a particular file helps to make sure that their input into the deliberation process is much more meaningful. And I'll give you a few specific examples of how we think it's shaped risk deliberation. One particularly important one is an ongoing debate about emergency management. I think from an outside perspective, bureaucracies in general tend to be very cautious about jurisdictional issues. So we tread very carefully, and where you get multiple jurisdictions impinging on a given file is where you're most likely to get a lot of the complexity and a lot of the I guess you could say the risk trade-offs aren't necessarily always well managed. And a lot of the public and intervener engagement has drawn attention to how emergencies are managed in Canada. As a result of their interventions, we've rethought a lot of the aspects of emergency management. In particular, how potassium iodide, which is a thyroid blocker, how it's to prevent uptake of radioactive iodine in an emergency. So how that's stockpiled, distributed, managed. We've all started to rethink that in response to intervener concerns. The cooling, both on intakes of the turbine condenser cooling water as it comes into the plant and out of the plant, is a matter of intense concern by a lot of civil society organizations and Indigenous groups. And as a result of their interventions, we've engaged them more broadly in monitoring campaigns and in a lot of the studies around species at risk, impacts on the lakes. So it certainly had a major impact there. And we're engaging, we're involving people much more broadly in environmental sampling campaigns, because their knowledge of their dietary needs, what's important to them, becomes important when we look at the various pathways that contaminants get into the environment. So I think I'll end it there and pass it on to the next discussant.
Great, thanks, Keith.